There's a box in the Los Angeles County Archives, catalog number 47, shelf row 9, that contains intake forms for a train that departed Union Station on March 9th, 1931. The forms list names, ages, and one column that was never explained in any official record. The column is labeled Destination Confirmed. For most of the passengers, that column is blank. A researcher found this box while tracing census anomalies, specifically while trying to understand why certain Southern California counties show a population drop of nearly 30% between the 1930 and 1940 census, a drop that no drought, no disaster, and no official explanation has ever accounted for. What the records revealed instead was this. Between 1929 and 1936, the United States government, operating through county welfare boards, railroad companies, and local police departments, removed an estimated 1.2 million people from American soil. Not undocumented workers, not recent arrivals, Americans, people born here, taxed here, buried here, rounded up at relief offices, at church steps, at their own front doors, loaded onto trains, and recorded in every official document that survived as voluntary departures. The word the government used was repatriation, but you cannot repatriate someone to a country they have never seen. And somewhere between the intake form and the destination column, more than 1 million names simply stop appearing in the American record. That is not bureaucratic error. That is a decision. And this is what it looked like. The story begins not with a raid, but with a press conference. On January 6, 1930, a man named Charles Vissell stood before reporters in Los Angeles and announced a new campaign. Vissell was the coordinator of the Los Angeles Citizens Committee on Coordination of Unemployment Relief, a title that sounds like charity and functioned like a clearance operation. His stated goal was to remove what he called deportable aliens from the city to free up jobs for, as he put it, Americans. The Los Angeles Times ran the announcement on the front page. The campaign had a name. It was called the Repatriation Drive. The official framing was straightforward. The country was in economic collapse. Unemployment had reached 25% nationally. Local governments were overwhelmed by relief applications. The argument went that if workers of Mexican descent, citizens or not, could be persuaded to return to Mexico, it would reduce the burden on public assistance and open jobs for white Americans. Persuaded is the word the documents use. What the documents describe is something different. The method was pressure. County relief offices across California, Texas, Colorado, and Michigan began requiring applicants of Mexican descent to prove citizenship before receiving any assistance. In many offices, this requirement was applied only to people with Spanish surnames, people who had lived in the United States for decades, who had no documents because no documents had ever been required, who had been born in states that did not issue birth certificates to rural families before 1910. Those people failed the documentation test, and when they failed it, they were offered a choice: accept repatriation or receive no relief at all. For a family with children and no income in the winter of 1930, that was not a choice. That was a sentence, but here is the detail that the official record does not address. Many of the people who boarded those trains had never been to Mexico. They were the children and grandchildren of Mexican immigrants. They were American-born. Under the 14th Amendment, they were citizens by birth, with the full constitutional protections that status entails. The government knew this, county welfare offices knew this, the railroad companies that accepted discounted contract rates to transport them knew this. The intake forms still exist in scattered county archives. Researchers who have examined them note a consistent feature: the citizenship status column is frequently left blank, not filled in with citizen or non-citizen, blank, as if the question had been decided not to ask. Los Angeles was the epicenter, but it was not alone. This is where the story stops being local and becomes something harder to dismiss. In Michigan, the Ford Motor Company had employed thousands of workers of Mexican descent throughout the 1920s. When the Depression hit and Ford began mass layoffs, local welfare authorities in Detroit launched their own repatriation campaign, as entire neighborhoods near the plant emptied between 1930 and 1932. Church records from St. Anne's Parish in Detroit, one of the oldest Catholic parishes in Michigan, show that 237 families listed as regular communicants in 1929 had vanished from the rolls by 1933, not moved to another parish, not marked deceased, simply absent with no forwarding entry. In Texas, the pattern repeated across the Rio Grande Valley. In Colorado, the beet farming communities that had supplied the sugar industry for 30 years were systematically depopulated. In Illinois and Indiana and Arizona, the same sequence. County Welfare Office announces documentation requirements. Applications from Spanish surname residents drop sharply. Local newspaper runs approving editorial about the burden being lifted. Train departs. Census numbers shift. Maybe the pattern is coincidence. Maybe 30 states independently arrived at the same policy in the same 2-year window for purely administrative reasons. Maybe the blank citizenship columns were oversight. But then you look at the timeline, and the timeline does not look like oversight. 1929, stock market collapse. Unemployment begins rapid rise. October 1930, January, Los Angeles launches formal repatriation drive. Charles Wiesel requests federal assistance from the Department of Labor. 1930, February, Secretary of Labor William Doak, a man appointed 2 months earlier, announces a nationwide campaign to identify and remove deportable aliens. He issues public statements claiming there are 400,000 illegal residents taking American jobs. The actual number his department produces in internal memos is significantly lower. The memos are not released publicly. 1930, March, first organized train departs Los Angeles for the Mexican border. The Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors subsidizes the ticket cost to accelerate departures. 1931 through 1936, an estimated 250 chartered train departures from California alone. Railroad company records where they survive show discounted governmental contract rates applied to these routes, rates that do not appear on any publicly approved budget line. 1940 census. The population of Mexican descent in California has declined by nearly 35% compared to 1930. No war, no famine, no recorded migration to other states. 35% of a population gone from the official count. The rapid-fire sequence of those dates does not prove design, but it does make the word voluntary difficult to sustain. There is a woman whose story appears in a 1995 oral history project conducted by California State University, Los Angeles. The project interviewed elderly residents of East Los Angeles about their family histories. This woman, identified only by her first name, Elena, at her request, was born in Boyle Heights in 1923. She was 7 years old in 1930 when her parents were visited by a county welfare official and told that their relief application had been reviewed and that transportation back to Mexico would be arranged at no cost to the family. Her parents had arrived from Jalisco in 1914. Her father had worked construction in Los Angeles for 16 years. Elena and her 2 brothers had been born in California. They were American citizens in the full legal sense. The family boarded a train at Union Station in the spring of 1931. Elena remembered the platform as being crowded with other families. She remembered that nobody was in handcuffs. She remembered that the county official on the platform was writing in a ledger. She remembered asking her mother where they were going and being told, somewhere with more work. They crossed the border at Nogales. Her father spent 11 years attempting to return legally. He succeeded in 1942 because the wartime Bracero program suddenly made Mexican labor welcome again. Elena returned to Los Angeles at the age of 19. Her 2 brothers, born in California, had spent their entire childhoods in a country they had not been born in. Speaking Spanish they had learned as a second language, stateless in the technical sense because neither the United States nor Mexico had formally acknowledged what had happened to them. Elena's story is not unique. It is not even unusual. Researchers who have worked with the surviving oral history collections estimate that tens of thousands of American-born children were removed during this period. Their birth certificates, where they existed, remained in American county records. Their names remained on school rolls where they had been enrolled, but they themselves were gone, entered into official records as voluntary departures, which is a category that requires no further paperwork and generates no further inquiry. The documents preserved what happened, the encyclopedias did not. Here's what makes this chapter of American history difficult to locate in standard reference materials. It was not kept secret in the traditional sense. The Los Angeles Times reported on the repatriation drive approvingly in 1930. Local officials gave speeches about it. The railroad contracts were public expenditure, at least partially. The policy was discussed openly in county budget meetings, the minutes of which still exist in municipal archives. What happened instead was a quieter kind of erasure. The language changed. By 1940, official government communications had almost entirely replaced the word repatriation with the word relocation. By 1950, county welfare records from the relevant period had been consolidated into general administrative storage with no subject indexing. By 1960, the event had no entry in the major American history textbooks. By 1970, a generation of American schoolchildren had graduated without encountering the names of Charles Vissell or William Doak in any curriculum. The survivors knew. Their children knew. The communities that had been depopulated knew in the way that communities know things that are never written down, through absence, through empty lots, through the names of neighbors who one spring simply were not there anymore. But knowing is not the same as documentation, and documentation is what determines what gets remembered and what gets classified under voluntary departure. There is a pattern in American institutional history where the most significant population movements are the ones with the least paperwork. The orphan trains moved 250,000 children with minimal documentation. The 1918 influenza removed hundreds of thousands of people from census projections with causes reclassified under secondary diagnoses. The repatriation campaigns of the 1930s moved more than 1 million people and generated, per capita, less surviving federal documentation than almost any comparable event in the 20th century. That is not an accident of record keeping. Record keeping in that era was thorough. The 1930 census itself, conducted in the same months the first trains were departing, was one of the most detailed in American history. What was not recorded was recorded deliberately. The blank columns in the intake forms were blank because someone decided not to ask the question. That is an administrative choice, and administrative choices have authors. In 2005, 75 years after the first trains departed, the state of California passed Senate Bill 670, the Apology Act for the 1930 Repatriation Program. It was the first formal governmental acknowledgement in American history that the repatriation campaigns had been wrong, that many of those removed had been citizens, and that the process had caused irreparable harm to families and communities. The bill passed. Governor Schwarzenegger signed it. The apology was issued. The federal government has never issued a corresponding apology. No congressional resolution has passed. No national memorial exists. The Department of Labor, the agency whose secretary publicly promoted the campaign in 1930, has never released a formal statement on the policy. The California apology is not nothing, and it is significant that a state government acknowledged in legal language what its predecessors had done. But an apology issued 75 years after the fact to a population that has largely passed away addresses the record, not the harm. And the record, the actual documentary record, the intake forms, the railroad contracts, the welfare office memos, remains scattered across county archives, partially indexed, accessible only to researchers who know specifically what they are looking for. The 1940 census shows where the people went. It shows the California counties that should have grown and instead shrank. It shows the agricultural regions that lost their entire labor force in 36 months and replaced it by 1942 with a government-managed import program that paid the same workers lower wages under federal contract. The arithmetic of those census columns lined up against each other describes a labor policy more clearly than any official document. 1.2 million people removed in 6 years. Returned in part 12 years later under a different program as foreign workers stripped of the citizenship status they had held before the trains departed. The language is precise when you read it carefully. Repatriation implies a home being returned to. Brachero, from the Spanish for arm, implies a tool. Somewhere between those two words is the actual history, and it is filed under voluntary departure in a ledger with a blank column where the destination should be. There are families in East Los Angeles and San Antonio and Detroit and Denver who carry this history the way families carry things that were never explained. A grandfather who would not talk about why the family left California. A grandmother who kept a birth certificate in an envelope at the back of a drawer and never explained why it had an American county seal and a date from before she could remember being in the United States. Children who grew up hearing two versions of family history, the one that could be told in public and the one that came out only at the end of a very long evening. The blank column in the intake form is still blank. The federal apology has still not been issued. The railroad contracts are still in county storage, partially indexed. The 1940 census still shows the missing 35%. And somewhere in those archives, in the ledgers, in the welfare office memos, in the railroad manifests with the discounted rate schedules is a number more precise than 1.2 million. The researchers who have spent careers on this question believe the actual total is higher. The documentation that would confirm it is the documentation that was never created, because the most effective erasure is not the one that destroys records. It is the one that ensures certain questions are never entered into the ledger in the first place. The column was blank because someone chose not to fill it in. That choice had a name, and the name is not on any memorial. Once you see that, you cannot stop seeing it.